Hi, Colin Marshall here, letting you know that you can now read a new essay from my upcoming book, A Los Angeles Primer, each and every week at KCET Departures. For details, visit colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. How much sense do you think it makes to talk about Vancouver as a postmodern city now in 2013?
That's a good question. I mean, postmodernism sort of, it went off the agenda, I guess, about 10 years ago or so. But I think some of the factors that I talked about in that book are still there. That is to say, this whole idea of the consumer city or the recreational city that has no real base. There's never been very much industry here. The industry has been in the interior. And also, of course, it's the most Asian city in North America. So a lot of what was discussed in that book back in 94 was the particular situation with the various ethnic groups here. And I think that's continued and is, perhaps even more dominant because we've now become a kind of beachhead for hot Chinese money, and that's having a huge effect on the real estate market here, at least the local market on the west side of town. And that's partly because if you want to buy a $5 million house in Sydney or Melbourne, you have to go in front of a foreign investment review board and get permission, which may not be forthcoming, whereas here we have an open door. And so it's a kind of refuge city, I think, both for money and for people. But if you want to go and live in Geneva or Sydney, you can't just do it, whereas in Vancouver, pretty much you can. So the immigration open door is still very much alive. And that means there's this kind of floating world of international people that I think, have a huge effect on the nature of the city.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from Yaletown, Vancouver, British Columbia, speaking with Paul Delany, professor of English at Simon Fraser University and the editor of a book that everybody mentioned, whom I spoke to, asking, what have you read about Vancouver? What books do you recommend? They always bring up Vancouver representing the postmodern city, this reader. And he's written more about Vancouver more recently in an article, which I still find relevant, like I still find the reader relevant, called Vancouver Graveyard of Ambition. But tell me...
The question mark.
Yeah, Vancouver Graveyard of Ambition? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We'll talk about it, certainly. And to what extent that still obtains 9-10 years later after that article. But almost 20 years after the reader, people still find this relevant. And, a reader from 1995 with the word postmodern, you would think, well, that's of a specific time. That's of the mid-90s.
Yes.
But why do you think the pieces in this book are still relevant to people?
Well, to tell the truth, I haven't been sort of counting my Amazon sales or anything like that, so I don't have that much idea about the impact. I think it was, it was a moment of self-consciousness that was happening there in the early 90s when we realized that Vancouver was on a certain kind of trajectory, something like what we were just talking about with immigration, with all these the sort of invisible economy that was developing, and also certain things that have become bigger since then. The three big figures in Vancouver intellectual life the last 20 years have been William Gibson, Doug Coupland, and Jeff Wall. And they've all, they were just coming to the foreground at that time. Now they're global figures, all of them, I think. And I think so that's been part of it.
You have a piece in the Reader about a William Gibson story, which to that point was the only one he'd used Vancouver as a setting for. He's since returned there in his writing, but you mentioned before we recorded, he inscribed in one copy of this reader for you, "No mo pomo."
Yeah.
A certain attitude is reflected in that, is it not?
One of William Gibson's sayings is that the future is not really the future, it's just been unevenly distributed.
Right.
Meaning that if you want to know what the future is going to be in 20 or 30 years, you just go to certain places in the world where...
To his mind, usually Japan.
Japan often, but other places as well. And so he likes to be ahead of things, so I guess he wanted to leave postmodernism behind. Now, what he claimed was going to replace it... I'm not really up to date with his latest books. Obviously, cyberspace was his huge coinage, although at that time, we didn't really know what the internet was going to do. So if you said what's going to succeed postmodernism, it probably would be some ideas about media society, the dominance of the internet, the Googleization of everything, and so forth. So that, if you wanted to say there's one thing that's replaced that, I think that would be it, the impact of the internet, socially and economically. But also, everywhere in the developed world now, there's a lot of thinking about, hey, we seem to have stopped and maybe we're going to go backwards. So a certain open-endedness, which has always been very typical of Vancouver. This is a place where people are always oriented towards the future, and they're saying, well, it's not so great now, but just come back in 5 years, and then you'll see. So that's very much the sort of emotional and intellectual atmosphere. What are we going to do? Because, it still is a relatively impoverished place compared with, Berlin with its 90 museums and all these sorts of things. Even Seattle is a much more established city, architecturally and in other ways. And that, I think, can be a virtue. You wonder what's going to happen.
In the mid-'90s, putting together the reader, what was your own attitude on what the future held for Vancouver? What were you thinking was lay in store back then? Well,
I think in my preface, I wouldn't have to take back too much. Predictions always dangerous, obviously, and Orwell's 1984 is a good example of a book that wasn't very good as prophecy, but was a great book nonetheless. But I think that the fundamental drivers of Vancouver's future, that as I saw them at that time, it has pretty much come true. For example, we tend to orient ourselves towards Seattle a lot, and in Seattle you have Boeing, you have Microsoft, you have Amazon, and the two latter are fairly recent. Vancouver, I said at that time that Vancouver, its major corporations and so on were actually shrinking rather than growing, and that's continued. Like, there just aren't any major corporations here. So although I think it's a creative place in certain ways, and now there seems to be a new kind of internet bubble occurring here right here in Yaletown and in other places. There's a lot of activity with little startups and things like that. But in those 20 years, for whatever reason, we haven't had any major corporation growing up here. And that's partly, I think, because, the British Columbia is to Canada as California is to the U.S., except that California, because of, first of all, scientific developments in the 30s and then the impact of World War II, it became the world capital of technology, combined with the climate and other things. But BC has never had that kind of dominant position in the Canadian mindscape, as it were, that California has in the United States. And also our media industries, movies, television, etc., they're still pretty much based in Toronto, just as they were in New York to begin with, and then they moved out to Hollywood in the 1920s or whenever it was. So, I don't have to cringe at what I saw as the developments 20 years ago. I hope that doesn't sound complacent, but I think it has developed roughly as I think people expected.
Was Vancouver a subject of discussion back then, or was this a distinctive thing you were doing, putting together a read around Vancouver? I mean, was it somewhat audacious to do that with Vancouver as a subject?
Well, I think part of that was that I came here from New York. I'm British originally, but my first academic job was at Columbia, so I spent the 60s at Columbia. And then I came out here in 1970, and people were always moaning, this is the end of the line, nothing happens here, et cetera, et cetera. And I always felt, well, here we are. It is an extraordinary place in certain ways, so let's try to have a commensurate kind of intellectual activity, and without being a booster, which would be silly, pay attention at least to what's going on here. And at that particular time in the early 90s, I think there were some interesting other people who immediately said, yeah, sure, I'd like to contribute. And I think it went on from there. Now, it's a more mature society intellectually than it was 20 years ago, just because it's got bigger, and UBC especially has become, a major, you could say, a global university. But we are still a little bit at the end of the line, and you still have the dominance of Toronto in Canadian culture. So I think there's more work to be done. But, I think we are getting somewhere.
What was the appeal of coming to Vancouver from New York City in 1970? And what was the state of the city of Vancouver back then that made it seem like a promising place to you?
Well, a good deal of that was push because of Vietnam, and I wasn't personally subject to the draft or anything like that, but, I was pretty fed up with the U.S. Because of Vietnam and other things that were happening in the late 60s, and I went to grad school at Berkeley, so, sort of got a good start on social unrest there. And I'd been an undergraduate at McGill, so my parents had emigrated to Canada when I was 16. And so the idea of coming back to Canada was attractive, and the access to nature, which is better than just about any other major city in the world, except maybe Oslo and maybe one or two others, that was definitely an attraction. The fact that there were, not very many restaurants and things like that, well, that didn't bother me particularly at that time.
The city had to look completely different as well.
Well, it was half the population, or possibly less, and it was full of hippies hitchhiking with their dogs everywhere, and there was plaid shirts and long hair, and it was a real outpost at that time. Yes, it's definitely grown up, but of course now it's been 40 years, so that's what you expect. But it's grown up because there were these fundamental drivers, and particularly I think a pretty enlightened city planning policy that has brought about this densification, such that there are only 5 or 6 really dense cities with important public transit in North America, and this has become one of them, which it wasn't when I came. They built the first rapid transit for Expo 86, and then they've continued to build, and now they have the Canada Line, which you may have come in on, and that's made the Canada Line has made the downtown a much more urban space as well.
When did it become possible to live 27 stories above the city like you're doing right now? We're looking down on it. I mean, that wasn't possible in 70, I would imagine.
Well, it was in a way, because in the 1950s, they rezoned the West End over there, and that's when they started building residential high-rises.
Oh, yes.
So there's been, and this is another thing, when people talk about TOD, transit-oriented development and so forth in the U.S., this has been happening for 50 years pretty steadily here in Vancouver. It's not going to happen overnight, and I think it will continue, certainly, but there was a big boost in the early 90s. Like if you take this building as an example, it was completed in 1994. It was people from Hong Kong looking towards the handover in 1997. I haven't checked, but I think it's quite likely that that this building was only marketed in Hong Kong, not even offered here.
And not totally uncommon for that practice to happen.
There were quite a few buildings with whom that happened. The people who originally developed it live up here right above me, and they have the entire floor.
Yes.
Instead of there being 3 apartments. So they're still there. But what's happened in that respect is that, first of all, there was kind of a bust because all the panic about the handover of Hong Kong didn't really play out in the way that was expected. But it had a huge impact on both economically and in terms of outlook here in Vancouver. I mean, everybody was oriented towards that. So what happened actually when 1997 was a bit of a letdown. The value of apartments in this building halved between 1997 and 2000, which was when I happened to buy it, fortunately, because I needed a place.
Good move.
Since then, it's gone back to what it was and a little bit more. But also, a lot of these buildings notoriously were what they called see-through buildings, where people from Hong Kong had bought, but they weren't actually living in the spaces. Yaletown now is quite different from that, as you may have noticed just walking around. It's now a bipolar distribution. It's 25 to 35-year-old people who get out of college and they come here and they work in these little software companies and things like that. And then it's empty nesters like me. And it's now pretty representative of the general population. That is to say, it's in no way an Asian enclave. There's a mixture of everybody here now, which I think is good. And that's the story of most of the buildings that you would see around here, I think, that, as I say, divided between people who have decent jobs downtown and empty nesters, although they are trying to bring in some daycare, and they built one school and maybe they'll build another one. So, because when this was first developed after Expo 86, this whole area along here, there weren't really any schools, and so it was very much childless young adults who came in, plus Hong Kong refugees. But now it's definitely it's flattened out, and there's much more diversity in the population.
I mentioned you are a professor of English. When did the city become a professional interest for you as well, an intellectual / professional / personal interest?
Well, I suppose living in New York in the 60s and seeing how a great city could fall apart was an interesting experience.
Now, tell me a little bit about how much you saw it fall apart, how much it had come apart by the time you left.
Well, it sort of hit bottom. I left in 1970, and it sort of hit bottom about 5 to 8 years after that. But the Upper West Side was definitely going way down. This was partly because of rent control, but also, tensions with Harlem, and more than one Columbia professor was actually murdered on the street, and there was a general feeling of great insecurity. And if you took the train from Grand Central to New Haven, which I used to do pretty regularly, I mean, it looked like, I was in Hamburg in 1951 or something, and that's what it looked like. I mean, abandoned buildings, one after the other, windows broken, everything falling down. Now, of course, the Upper West Side is, I was just there visiting a friend. It's, it's fashionable, it's expensive, it's even going back to its position where it was more desirable than the East Side. So that's the work of, Giuliani and others, which is obviously not without controversy.
Yes, indeed.
But yeah, it was kind of amazing how far down New York was allowed to go at that time. So to come here was kind of a revelation. The infrastructure here has generally been kept up, and it's sort of clean and polite. Maybe a bit boring, but so. And then, of course, if you teach English, especially the novel, well, the 19th century novel, you have Dickens, you have, many others who are fascinated by the phenomenon of the modern city, and it just sort of goes on from there, I suppose. Plus, the city, people became interested in it because English is always sort of trying to move out and colonize or be parasitic on other things. And, the city was a place where you could look at it as a kind of text, but you could also bring in a lot of other things, sociology, economics, architecture, which I'm certainly interested in.
Yes.
And then the environmental movement, of course, came in. That's something that I was less aware of in that book 20 years ago. But now, of course, environmentalism is a huge issue, and Vancouver is, in certain ways, a pioneering city in that respect, I think.
I do think of the city, any cities, as one of the best possible nexus of subjects. I would take it you would agree with that?
Yes, absolutely, yes. It's a way of trying to bring everything together, I think. Plus, as I say, this idea that it's a text or a visual text, if you like. You look out the window and you can see what's happened historically and different architectural styles, et cetera, et cetera. So, yes, it's fascinating. And, of course, I travel like other people, and so I'm interested in what's happening in London, what's happening in Geneva, where I lived for a year, et cetera, et cetera.
In 1995, was there much to read about Vancouver at all outside of professional literature?
I don't think there was a lot, and, the tradition in Canadian literature was, something very much oriented towards maybe the old Protestant conscience, but also about interaction with nature and the wilderness. A friend of mine used to say that the archetypal Canadian short story was boy kills raccoon, feels guilt. and so,
I can see that.
And so, and there was also this big period of Canadian nationalism in the 60s and 70s, which has now subsided. And so there wasn't a lot of writing being done about urban life. I mean, people wrote about being in a cabin in the woods and having spiritual experiences or those sorts of things. And it's still perhaps a little bit, I think, Gibson, as we discussed, has written about Vancouver a little bit, and I think it's not coincidental that he lives here, although he's originally from Virginia or somewhere like that. He was a draft dodger back in the 60s, but I think Jeff Wall, of course, is the dominant figure when you're talking about visual culture here. And I think in a very I think he really is a major artist, and that's been recognized. So I think he's the one that has sort of seen what there is to see here. Yes.
Is there a sense in which Canada is a bit uncomfortable with its urban centers? Like they have cultivated them, but is there ever a feeling that Canada is not a country that easily accommodates large cities modern cities, futuristic cities?
No, I think that's an illusion, because what is the most urbanized country in the world? It's Australia. And Canada is rather like that. First of all, you've got this huge concentration of population within 100 miles of the U.S. border. You're up to about 95% of the population there. And then secondly, for various historical reasons, we've developed these three dense urban centers: Montreal, Toronto, and now Vancouver. So, no, I don't. I mean, Canadian literature was maybe a little bit behind in, being out in the bush and things that happened there. But, but also, of course, as I think I discussed a little bit in the postmodernism book, the opposition to the, if you want to talk about opposition to the city, I think it's much more important in the U.S. than here. First, and secondly, that's basically about race and white flight from the city center, and this legacy of slavery, which is still, I think, very much with you in the U.S. and that has meant also that. I don't know whether you've seen this book, The Big Sort, that I reviewed recently, but that's about how America is becoming more and more two countries, and Republican voters and so on are more and more exurban and oriented to having a lot of space around them. And then there's this hostility to the inner city, seen as democratic, unsafe, etc., etc. I mean, look at Detroit; it's fantastically bad. What's happening to Detroit, yes. or what happened to New York in the 60s and 70s. And there was this famous headline when they were in financial trouble. Whoever it was, Ford was the president or something.
Ford to City.
Yeah, Ford to City, dropped dead, right? So that's a big strain in American culture, I think, not really in Canadian culture in that way. Yeah.
And you're well placed to answer this. I mean, tell me, how does it compare the way that England regards its cities compared to America, compared to Canada, and how they deal with their cities? Is there some place on this spectrum to discuss England as well?
Well, Britain is a bit different, because you have this huge dominance of London, which only increases. So it's really London against the rest. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that the other populous cities in England, the next two would be Birmingham and Manchester after London. They're both 19th century cities that grew up with industrialization. So they're not actually historic cities with an architectural legacy comparable to London, or cities, historic cities like Edinburgh or Oxford or whatever. So, the huge issue in Britain is, how do you somehow balance out this complete dominance of London over any, it has no rivals, right? And also London, of course, is the world financial capital. And so London is, it's ethnically highly diverse, which makes it different from, any other. I think it's fair to say that London is kind of a country in itself, right? Canada's a federal country. Each province has its own way of looking at things. The Great French-English Divide, etc. So, like Scotland is ruled from Westminster, right? So that's fundamentally very different from a place like BC that has its own provincial government with a lot more powers than Scotland has. Now they may separate, but that's that's another story. I mean, what happened in Britain was that when you got rapid communication in the 19th century, everything just drained into London. Like Edinburgh used to be a major publishing centre, for example. Once you had because it took 3 days to get to London. Once you had the railway and you get to London in 10 hours, Edinburgh Publishing died, and lots of other things died in Britain. Everything goes to London. It's not really very comparable, and the whole question of space here is so different. Like BC is just one province, but it's bigger than France and Germany combined, and it's got a population of 4.5 million or so. So it's different world here.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
What difference does it make in your experience of a city when, like in Vancouver as opposed to London, the built environment is essentially all new?
Well, that would be fine if the architecture were better than it is, but I'm fundamentally quite disappointed with the architectural quality of what's been built, and there have been problems also with structural integrity. I don't know whether you know, but there's been a big crisis about leaky condos
yes, the leaky condo crisis.
in this town. But apart from that, unfortunately, the urban design panels and so forth, I think, have a pretty narrow idea of what a high-rise should look like. And for example, they all have to be pretty much the same color. It's pity we're not doing video, but you could look at a building over there, which is the second highest building in Vancouver, and you'll see that it's black. And there was a big fight over that.
Really?
Because they said, well, they should all look, this sort of sea green color. And architecturally, there have been a lot of really bland, really standard buildings. Now, hopefully that's going to change, because we are starting to get a few internationally recognized or more imaginative local architects. But, it's a bit late now, because downtown is largely built out now. But there's, as you may know, there's going to be a tower over here by Bjarke Ingels, the Danish company, and that's one of the most interesting buildings that's been projected.
What makes it so interesting?
I can't really take the time to describe it, but it's just a lot more imaginative than almost anything that's been built here in recent years. And that has to do with, again, people might not like this, but I think it is too provincial in terms of the very strong feeling that if you're going to build anything, you should use a local architect. We don't need any of these international mucky-mucks that think they're so great. And so, the downtown library, which was the result of an architectural competition, is very much the exception. And there's why is Spain the liveliest country in the world now for architecture? Because every major building there has to go to public international competition. And it's not coincidental, I think, that Spain also has some great local architects. Because, in fact, everybody benefits when you get that kind of ferment. So I would love to see more international architects or Eastern Canadian architects coming here, and more competitions.
On the cover of the Reader, Vancouver representing the postmodern city, we have an architectural model of the library. Why is that there?
Why is it on the cover? Well, because it was both the biggest and the most sort of blatantly postmodern building that had gone up at that time. And also there was a huge controversy because Safdie, although he's Canadian, his practice has been mainly in Israel, but he's done major buildings elsewhere in Canada and in the US as well. And there were 3 finalists, and they had models, and they put them on display, and people voted as to which one they liked. And the other 2 were local architects, and there was a big hullabaloo when people actually liked Safdie's model, and then when he won the competition. So that's why it seemed the obvious thing to put on the cover. And then underneath that, you've got some photo art of that. That was something else that was just starting to burgeon at that time. Not just Jeff Wall, but other photo artists, all of whom pretty much knew each other and worked together at that time. Yes.
Atop the model of the library, you have this lovely area with models of people walking around in trees. That's not how that was actually built, was it?
Well, yes, because after Safdie won the competition, they said this is costing too much, and so they cut back the budget, and they said, well, you've got to live with this budget. And so the roof garden was one of the things that went, and the building itself became less complicated, less interesting. But as I was saying to you just before, they now have a budget and the potential to open up the roof garden and have a cafe and have public space, and that's going to be a great thing. And that will make the library, the library, it has to be said, whether you like the architecture or not, it's been a huge success in terms of its popularity, especially with language students, but who've made it sort of their campus, but just in general. And well, I'm sure you've seen the Seattle Public Library again, yes. Rem Koolhaas again. That's a huge success.
And equally controversial, it seems. I don't know how controversial this still is, this building, but
well, I think people quite like it now, but there was certainly very vocal opposition at the time. And again, it's the social thing. Allegedly, I don't know whether this can be true, but they say that on a weekday there were 30,000 international language students in downtown Vancouver. Sort of swanning around while taking their classes, but also, going to restaurants or whatever. And the library has become their focus. It's it's a hugely functional and successful public space, and I think that's excellent. And we need more of that, because I think as you've probably seen, another issue with Vancouverism that they talk about is that they have this single model of the tower with the podium, with the townhouses, attached to it and taking up part of the lot. And that, I think, has been an almost total failure, in the sense that the idea was, Jane Jacobs, that you needed eyes on the street and people would sit on their front porches and say hi to people walking by. That just hasn't happened. I mean, people do buy those townhouses and they live in them, but they haven't animated the street in the way that they were supposed to do. And it's very difficult, I think, to plan public space in such a way that it works. Sometimes you just can't tell, but the library is certainly one such space. And then outside space by the art gallery has become the focus for political demonstrations and things like that.
Overall, I mean, have you observed much change, not just in the form of the city, but in the way people use it? I mean, might people be using their townhouses in a more eyes on the city type way later? Just in terms of the way people regard Vancouver and make use of it, does that change much to your mind?
Well, if you have time, we can walk around a little bit afterwards, and I can try to show you what I mean. Another issue with these, with all these towers, they're very successful in certain ways, but they are, it's all about secure space and fear of the disorder of the street, which is actually not that disorderly, but, these are fortresses. J.G. Ballard said that these high-rises were prisons with the locks on the inside. As we sit here, there are 4 levels of security between us and the street. And that's the way people want it. And I can't say that I'm against it, because, I like the feeling of security as well. But that does mean that, as you can see, the street is a very different place. You look down on it, there's a kind of surveillance, feeling about it. Now, in Yaletown, it nonetheless works, because you have these low-rise buildings, and it's become a focus for young people to go to clubs, go shopping, etc., etc. So it is a very lively and safe pedestrianized area, but I don't think the tower and podium model can take a huge amount of credit for that, except that it does create the density. And now we have the rapid transit station down there, which is contributing also. But as you probably know, they didn't want to have a New York-type streetscape where the whole block would be high-rise.
Right.
and then you get problems with how much light is going to get in, etc. So the rule here is that each tower must be at least 90 feet apart so that there's, views are preserved to some extent, and so on. But then it does create this issue of, well, what are you going to do with the other space, which townhouses, in my view, haven't worked all that well to fill that space. Whether there's an alternative model, I'm not sure. And I know that they seem to be starting to build residential high-rises in LA quite a bit now, and I'm not sure how that's going to... In fact, some of them are being done by developers from here, so I'm not sure how that's going to work. You'd have to tell me about that.
Many of them are converted older office buildings, and the new ones go up like between them. And so far, there's not so many that there's a threat to any view you might get or light. But I didn't realize that some of the builders were actually from here.
Yes, I mean, I can't cite names at the moment, but there's considerable expertise here, and there's this area in San Francisco that has been sort of explicitly planned to be Vancouverized and to renew San Francisco. I mean, that's another story, but it has become kind of a world model, I think, which is good. Although, it's a complex mixture because, one hates to say it, but central cities in America are still about race and all the tensions that go about that and the hostility to central cities. And so that's one of the things that has made central Vancouver very successful, but, attempts to pedestrianize and densify most American cities have failed. And, the interstate highway system had something to do with that as well. Like Seattle has 4 times the area of Vancouver, and it's only got sort of 50% more population, so it's vastly more spread out than we are here. Plus, you need to get a critical mass, which we now have, and so it's become very desirable to be downtown. I mean, did anybody talk to you about Microsoft coming here?
So far, I haven't talked to anybody about that yet, no.
Okay, well, that's an interesting story because Microsoft put in a development center in suburban Richmond down near the airport about 5 years ago. And they put it in largely because they could bring in programmers from India or whatever much more easily because of the immigration rules. So they set up there, and then it was in one of these malls. And then they discovered, guess what? A lot of these programmers we're bringing in don't know how to drive a car. So how are they going to get to work? So what they did a year or two ago was abandon that, and now they're in an office building right here downtown on public transit. So actually the suburban kinds of malls and office buildings are a little bit in decline, and now people want to be downtown. Plus, of course, you've got your Indian restaurants, etc. here. So there's a kind of moving towards the center in that respect, which I thought that's an interesting story. Yeah.
Despite all the offerings of Vancouverism, what led you to ask whether Vancouver was a graveyard of ambition?
Well, that was Dylan Thomas who came up with that phrase, and he was talking about Cardiff. So, he had to get out of Wales. And, there was certainly this feeling when I first came that if you wanted to make it, go to Hollywood and be a scriptwriter, go to Toronto and have power, be a politician, go to Ottawa, et cetera, et cetera. And I was sort of on the reverse trajectory because I was coming from the Upper West Side of New York to here. So does that mean that, that's the last anybody's going to hear about me, or worse, that, I would never do anything again because I would just, it's the lotus-eating mentality that life here is relatively easy, and so you don't have to struggle too much. I think, I wrote that article about 10 years ago now. And I think that there's more of a feeling now that, you can make a career here, that there's a kind of steady growth in lots of things. And so there's maybe less of a feeling that you're really stuck where nobody's ever going to hear of you again. Although I think, it is a danger. Like Nietzsche said that the best people in the world were the Russians because things were so tough. You had to be a real person to survive in Russia. Right. Okay. Whereas here, it's where's the stimulation? Where's the fear when you walk down the street, yes, etc. So, yeah, it is easy to, go skiing at Whistler, get your boat, do those sorts of things, care about your lifestyle and not really care about what's going on in other places, because this is, among major cities, this is probably the most, safely removed from what's going on in North Korea or Iran or in New York, for that matter. Right. So, yeah, it's a danger. But, and I suppose my reaction to that has been, well, let's try to think about what is here and write about it. And, right, I've done other things, but I've always been interested in, what are the possibilities here.
Is another strategy for you to travel outside Vancouver as much as you can?
Well, I do, because I have, one child in New York, one child in the Bay Area, and for the work that I do, which is, British cultural history, I have to go to the UK pretty much every year, sometimes more than once, and I go to Mexico, which everybody here does. So, yeah, when you go, you have your eyes open, and but you have less of a feeling now that, that there's, and if you want to see any sort of paintings or any cultural activity, you've got to go see a play in London or whatever. I mean, there's definitely more things happening here all the time. And the other thing that's happened, of course, is that the media are such now that it doesn't really matter where you are. I mean, you see the same movies, you read the same books as people are reading in London and New York and so forth. I mean, obviously there's no substitute for actually going, but, 80% of what is culturally consumed in London and New York can be consumed here in almost the same way. And, the high-definition broadcasts of the Metropolitan Opera would be a good example of that, I think. Because the danger is that might kill the local opera, but so far it hasn't. I think maybe it's even helped it a bit.
When you spend time in London or in New York or in San Francisco, or you mentioned Mexico, I just recorded interviews in Mexico City last month. When you spend time in these cities, what are you reminded of about Vancouver? How does your time in these places reflect back on the city that you return to?
I mean, everybody that lives here tends to say, well, it's great when you get off the plane and you get your first breath of Vancouver air and you realize, how agreeable it is, well, at least when the sun is shining like today, that, and the sort of ratio of people to space is, it's very favorable. There are enough people on the street here that it's lively, but it's not like going through Oxford Circus tube station or something like that, or Times Square, taking the shuttle, which I was just doing. I mean, it's, the density and the energy and the fear and the ambition is, it's kind of terrifying. Nobody's terrified here in that way. And that feeling in New York, that it's just a constant struggle to keep your head above water. I mean, of course, people here do struggle, but it's just not the kind of visible struggle that it is in New York. And neither do we have, the whole class of the ultra-rich leading their insulated lives that you have in those cities. So it's a very different, moral atmosphere, I guess. And of course, if you've been to Mexico City, I haven't been there for a while, but again, 20 million people, and sort of seething of every sort going on, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. In fact, you have quite a few rich Mexicans now that are buying apartments here because they don't have to worry about their children being kidnapped and all that sort of thing.
That seething, whether it is the seething of Mexico City or the seething of New York, I mean, there's something that I hear posited often, which is that, say, when New York went into its decline in the 60s and 70s, there was a cultural ascendance that went along with that political and infrastructural decline. Do you buy that idea that culture rises up when everything else falls in a city?
Well, it was a creative time, wasn't it? And, you could go to a club and there was Andy Warhol looking more dead than any live person I've ever seen. He had this sort of, I guess it was makeup, but he had this sort of putty-coloured face. It was quite extraordinary.
But he was a common sight for you?
Well, I saw him once, but you did see people like that on the street. Allen Ginsberg, people like that. But that was a function of the old Greenwich Village culture that was still there, and decline has its virtues. I mean, Seattle was a good example when in the 70s when Boeing crashed. And they said, will the last person to leave Seattle please turn out the lights? And then what happened? Well, people came in, there were cheap rents. Microsoft grew up, Amazon grew up, Boeing revived, et cetera, et cetera. So that was actually quite a creative time for Seattle when there was this huge slump, because, of course, the issue here, among others, is the huge cost of housing relative to income. So if we had a recession and, artists could get an apartment for $200 a month, that would be good for artists.
It would take something fairly extreme event for that to happen, though, I would take it.
Well, you don't know, do you? I mean, nobody would have expected Seattle to go down as far as it did, but then how fast it was able to come back. And, of course, they made a virtue out of it because you had grunge and all of that. So let's make a virtue out of our decline. Now, Detroit, I think, is maybe more mortally sick. I don't know. I don't know Detroit at all, really. But when you have the fundamental lifestyle advantages of the mountain, the ocean, etc., you could have quite a serious recession and it would still be a lively place and would have these sort of compensating virtues like cheaper housing. But, New York's always been the cultural capital of the U.S., well, since Boston sort of conceded that place. And so whether New York is booming or busting, there's always going to be a lot of things happening there.
How much is to be learned about Vancouver by keeping an eye on the young people, whether they're students or just the people you see milling around Yaletown? Is there much to be learned about what will happen in Vancouver from them?
Well, I'm probably not the best person to ask. I mean, I do have a daughter who's 30 and who lives here, and her partner is a software guy, and so I hear a little bit about what's going on in software around here. And as I say, it actually seems to be doing pretty well. He keeps getting one job after another, getting more money, and so on and so forth. I mean, I suppose the thing that strikes an old fogey like me is, how they're always wired into something in the ears and every other orifice kind of thing.
Yes, indeed.
So the wired world, I think, is very much part of that. But I don't go to the nightclubs and so on. But what is kind of interesting, if you're around about midnight on what day is it today? It's Thursday. Okay, well, tomorrow and Saturday, if you go down to Granville Street around midnight, you'll see a gigantic human zoo, and it's actually. It's quite scary in some ways. I try to avoid it. You'll see the cops out. This idea about nice, well-mannered Canadians. Well, be on Granville Street at 1 o'clock on Saturday morning.
See the real deal.
Yeah, and that's a large part of that is because of the transit that they've put in. because all these kids come in from the suburbs, right?
Ah.
It's sort of like Saturday Night Fever, that thing, but it's just this huge mob scene there. And, it can get quite violent and disorderly and so forth. So that, that's one side of this sort of downtown as a kind of consumer festival kind of space, right?
So almost 20 years ago, you wrote in this book, Vancouver Representing the Postmodern City, speculating on the future of Vancouver. Yeah. About 9-10 years ago, you asked whether Vancouver was a graveyard of ambition. Today, what questions would you be asking about Vancouver? I mean, would the word postmodern still be involved if you were writing a similar piece right this moment?
I don't think we really have at this point a kind of fruitful intellectual model that postmodernism, I think, was a good model at that time. Now I think, obviously, there's much more emphasis on the financial system and the possible collapse of that. And, well, it did collapse, but they sort of, they gave it life support, and
yes.
The heart started to beat again. Well, something's died. That's another sort of virtue in lack, I think, about Vancouver. It's not a financial center, so it hasn't been affected by the kinds of bubbles that you got on Wall Street and in London, and the financial chaos that's going on in continental Europe. And it also means that we don't have this sort of top level of people who have, huge amounts of money, and that drives up the prices of everything that they consume. I mean, the big money here, insofar as there is any, tends to be flight money coming from China, Mexico, wherever. But we don't really have an indigenous class of very wealthy people here. So where will it go? I mean, I think, well, as I said before, I'm hopeful that something is going to present itself such that this particular place may have, may continue to be culturally creative. I mean, the universities are obviously part of that, and we have two here, and they're doing two major ones. And we've got the Emily Carr School of Art, a lot of things have come out of that. And they're moving to a new campus, and they're going to expand. So all of that will happen. But beyond that, you can't really predict where the culture is going to go. I mean, the big three that I mentioned, William Gibson, Doug Coupland, Jeff Wall, they've all been producing for 20 years or more now. So the interesting question, I think, is, who's going to follow after them? Will there be another generation? And I'm not sufficiently clued in to say, well, here's the rising star and so on. But I think that, because it's a magnet city, because so many young people come here after college, the whole Richard Florida thing, the creative city, et cetera, which can be overdone, but there's some truth to that, I think. So I think it is, both a national and potentially a global creative city. And although I don't think the creative city model is going to really work for the U.S. as a whole, with the various problems that it has, but I think Vancouver is a kind of ideal, typical creative city in Richard Florida's terms, and so it would just be interesting to see how that develops, because there isn't really this rival thing that if you read, say, Joel Kotkin, he writes these pieces basically demonizing public transit and saying what people want is to have their acreage in the exurbs, and that's the American way, and you shouldn't even try to interfere with that. And so he slags Portland and so on as, trying to promote a model that real Americans don't really like or want. you don't really have that tension here. And so I think we are very open to the future and what it can bring. And also, of course, this is to some extent now a suburb of Asia, and, Asia, for better or worse, it probably is, the future 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road. And this is the most Asian city in North America. Just in terms of the percentage of the population of Asian origin.
In that sense, it has a hand or a foot in the future.
Well, both, I suppose. Yeah.
I've been speaking here in Yaletown, Vancouver, British Columbia, with Paul Delany, professor of English at Simon Fraser University, and the editor of Vancouver, representing the Postmodern City, still the Vancouver book I hear the most about. Paul, thanks so much.
You're very welcome, and there's lots more to be said, but I hope I've covered some of the main points.
Very much so. This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munvirzi, Rob Montz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Noman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.